You destroyed our family. I hope you're happy. Just so you know, we're contesting the will. Because that. I never imagined that a simple invitation from my father would set off the chain of events that completely changed my life. My name is Rachel, and I'm 27 years old, living in Cleveland, trying to balance a demanding job in graphic design with my need for peace and quiet. The one place I ever truly found that peace was at the lakeside cottage I inherited from my great uncle Albert 3 years ago. That place in Vermont wasn't just a house by the water. It was my sanctuary from the constant noise of the city, the deadlines at work, and, honestly, the people who claimed to be my family. When I was 14, my mother died suddenly after a short battle with illness, and I remember watching my dad fall apart in a way that terrified me. We clung to each other during those first brutal years, and for a while, it felt like maybe we could make it through together. That didn't last. My father met Linda at a company event, and it didn't take long before she and her two grown sons, Brian and Kyle, became part of my life whether I wanted them there or not. From the start, their presence felt forced and uncomfortable. I tried, truly I did, to welcome them into the space that still felt like my mother's, but they always kept a polite distance that never softened, no matter what I did. Linda's boys were older than me, with their own lives and their own friends, and they treated me like some awkward kid who didn't fit into their world. Linda, for her part, was always polite on the surface, but her warmth never reached her eyes, and I always felt like an outsider in my own home. My dad changed too, and that was the hardest part of it all. He went from being my protector to someone who seemed eager to impress his new family, always choosing their needs over mine without even realizing it. When I left for college, I thought I'd feel sad, but what I really felt was relief. I couldn't wait to escape that house and the suffocating tension that lived in every room. Coming home on breaks was awful. Linda had redecorated the house so thoroughly that it barely felt familiar anymore. My mother's photos were gone, replaced by framed shots of Brian and Kyle at graduations, birthdays, and vacations I hadn't been invited to. I became a guest in what used to be my home, and every visit reminded me of that. After graduation, I moved back for a few months to save up for an apartment, and those months were some of the most miserable of my life. Linda had mastered the art of exclusion. She'd cook dinner for 4 people when 5 lived under the same roof, and when I pointed it out, she acted like she'd simply forgotten. She'd plan outings and somehow always leave me out of the loop, then express surprise when I asked where everyone had gone. My dad either didn't see what was happening or chose not to, and either way, I stopped trying to make him see it. When I finally scraped together enough money to move into a small place of my own, I felt like I could breathe for the first time in years. That was around the time I started spending more weekends with great Uncle Albert at the cottage. He was in his late 80s, sharp as ever, and full of stories about his wild youth. I'd bring him groceries, help him with repairs, and sit on the porch with him as he watched the lake with the peacefulness I envied. The cottage became my refuge, the one place I felt like I belonged. When Albert passed away at 91, I handled the funeral arrangements because no one else seemed interested in doing it. My father and Linda came to the service, but I overheard them talking more about what would happen to the property than about the man we were there to honor. When I found out Albert had left me the cottage and a small inheritance, I was stunned. I thought about selling it to buy something closer to work, but when I mentioned it at dinner, Linda jumped in before my dad could say a word. "Don't rush into anything," she said, her eyes gleaming in a way that made me uneasy. "That property's a gold mine. You'd be foolish to let it go. Lake houses always go up in value." My dad agreed, and so I held on to it. I gave them a key, not thinking much of it at the time, just trying to be kind. For a while, when they used it, they at least told me first. But eventually, they started treating it like their own private vacation home, dropping by whenever they felt like it, bringing Brian and Kyle along, without asking. At first, I didn't mind. I barely had time to get up there myself between work projects, and I figured they were family, so it wasn't a big deal. That changed the weekend. I decided to surprise myself with a quiet retreat at the cottage. I drove 6 hours, dreaming of sitting on the deck with coffee in the early morning, watching the mist rise off the lake. Instead, I walked in to find Brian, Kyle, and a crowd of their friends already there, blasting music, drinking, and treating the place like some frat house rental. When I confronted them, Brian actually had the nerve to look annoyed. He acted like I was the intruder, like my presence was the inconvenience, not theirs. The argument that followed ended with them packing up and leaving, but that wasn't the end of it. Linda called me that night, furious that I'd embarrassed her sons in front of their friends, as if I had any obligation to let them trash my home. After that, my relationship with my father grew colder than ever. So when he called me a few months later and invited me to dinner, I hesitated but agreed, hoping maybe he wanted to make things right. I let myself believe, for one naive moment, that maybe they regretted how they treated me, that maybe we could find a way back to something that felt like a family. What they actually wanted left me more hurt than I ever could have imagined. I remember driving over that evening with a strange mix of hope and dread swirling in my chest. I kept thinking maybe this was it. Maybe they finally saw how far apart we drifted and wanted to fix it somehow. My father greeted me at the door with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, and that should have been my first clue that something was off. Linda sat on the couch in the living room, her expression carefully neutral, the kind of look that never meant anything good coming from her. I tried to keep my voice light as I settled into the chair across from them, asking what they wanted to talk about. My father cleared his throat and glanced at Linda, as if waiting for her permission to speak. I could see the tension in his hands, the way he kept twisting his wedding ring around his finger. Before he could get a word out, Linda jumped in, her voice sweet but with that edge I'd come to recognize over the years. "We've been thinking a lot about how to bring the family together," she said, as if this was some kind of peace offering. She went on about how things had been strained lately and how they missed spending time as a family. Then she said they wanted us all to take a vacation together at the lake cottage. Her sons, their fiancés, my father, Linda, and of course, me. I was surprised, I won't lie. I felt that flicker of hope again, thinking maybe they wanted to finally include me in something real. They talked about taking 10 days, really settling in, reconnecting, and making memories. I even smiled and started planning in my head, thinking about the meals I could make, the activities we could do together. I told them it sounded nice, and for the first time in a long time, I meant it. I wanted to believe they were sincere. That night, I went home feeling lighter than I had in ages, already making lists of supplies and picturing how perfect this vacation could be if we all just tried. Over the next few weeks, I poured my energy into getting the cottage ready. I spent an entire weekend up there, scrubbing floors, washing windows, cleaning out closets, and making sure everything was spotless. I bought new bedding, fresh towels, and stocked the kitchen with everything we'd need for big family meals. I even picked up extra chairs for the deck, new fishing poles, and inflatable rafts for the lake. Every dollar I spent felt like an investment in the family I thought I might finally have. 3 days before we were supposed to leave, my father called again and asked if I could come by that evening. His voice sounded strange, but I told myself not to read too much into it. Maybe they wanted to discuss the meal plan or offer to help with the groceries. Maybe they wanted to contribute somehow. I tried to keep my optimism alive as I drove over, but the second I walked into that house, I knew something was wrong. My father couldn't look me in the eye. He gestured for me to sit down, and Linda sat on the couch like a queen preparing to deliver a decree. I tried to ease the tension by mentioning the menu I'd started planning, but Linda cut me off. She folded her hands in her lap and said they decided that I wouldn't be joining them on the vacation after all. For a second, I thought I'd misheard her. I actually laughed because the idea seemed so absurd after everything we'd talked about. But no, she wasn't joking. Linda sat there, calm as could be, and explained that this trip was meant for close family only, for bonding time between her sons, their fiancés, and my father. My presence, she said, would only make things awkward, and it was better if I stayed behind. I looked at my father, waiting for him to speak up, to say this was ridiculous, but he just stared at his hands like a man who had already decided not to fight. I tried to reason with them, pointing out that it was my cottage, that I'd done all this work to prepare for us. Linda shrugged and said they had the key and would be careful with the place. She said I could use it after they were done. My father opened his mouth a few times as if to speak, but didn't say anything that mattered. Every second that passed chipped away at what little faith I still had in him. I left their house that night feeling like the ground had shifted under me. All that hope I'd let myself feel was gone, replaced by a cold fury I could barely contain. I paced my apartment for hours, replaying the conversation over and over in my head, trying to figure out how I could have been so naive. They didn't want me there. They didn't care how much I'd done to make this vacation happen. They just wanted my house, my hard work, and my silence. The next night, as if things couldn't get worse, I saw a post from Brian on social media that made my blood boil. He'd written about how excited he was for the family trip, how good it would be to have time together without any unnecessary drama or unwelcome guests. Linda and my father had both liked the post, as if they agreed with every word. That was the moment I knew I couldn't let them get away with this. If they wanted to act like I wasn't family, I would show them exactly what that meant. I didn't sleep at all the night I saw that post, because my mind wouldn't stop racing through all the ways I could make them regret what they were doing. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured Brian's smug face and Linda's cold smile, and I knew there was no way I could let them take what was mine without a fight. They'd gone too far this time, and I was done letting them walk all over me. I sat in the dark, staring out my apartment window at the empty street below, and made a decision that felt so right, I didn't even question it. The next morning, I called my friend Amanda, who I knew would have my back no matter what. Amanda was always the one who said yes before I even finished explaining my crazy ideas, and this time was no different. The second I told her what was going on, she was furious for me, and she offered to drive up to the cottage with me the following week. She even volunteered to bring her boyfriend Chris and her cousin Danielle, both of whom I knew and trusted. When I told her I wanted to fill the house with people who actually cared about me, she said she'd make it happen. That same afternoon, I called a locksmith and arranged for him to meet me at the cottage 2 days before my so-called family was supposed to arrive. I wasn't taking any chances that they'd try to sneak in before I could change the locks. Every part of me felt lighter the moment I made that call, like I was finally taking back control of a situation that had been spiraling for far too long. Over the next few days, I packed up everything I'd need, made lists of what I wanted to stock the house with, and reached out to a few more friends who I knew would be thrilled at the offer of a free lake vacation. By the time I pulled into the driveway of the cottage with Amanda beside me, I felt like a completely different person. The locksmith arrived right on time, and while he worked, I walked through every room of the house, feeling the anger I'd carried for weeks finally start to melt into something else. I wasn't going to let them ruin this place for me. I wasn't going to let them erase me from the one part of my life that still felt like mine. Once the locks were changed and I had the shiny new keys in my hand, I cooked myself a simple dinner and sat out on the deck, watching the sun sink behind the trees. I sipped a glass of wine and breathed in the quiet, feeling more at peace than I had in months. Tomorrow, I knew, would be a day to remember, and I was ready for whatever came. When the car started pulling into the driveway the next day, my heart pounded so hard I thought it might break through my chest. I watched from behind the upstairs curtains as they unloaded their bags and coolers, all of them laughing and talking like nothing could possibly go wrong. Linda was pointing at the house, probably assigning bedrooms in her mind, while Brian and Kyle carried suitcases and their fiancés trailed behind, snapping photos of the lake like they'd discovered it themselves. I stayed upstairs until I saw Linda try the front door, only to find that her key no longer worked. I saw the confusion on her face turn to frustration as she jiggled the handle, then called over my father to try. They moved around to the back, thinking maybe the other door would open, but I'd been thorough. When both doors refused to budge, the mood shifted. Linda's voice rose as she started pounding on the front door, demanding that I open up. I took my time coming downstairs, letting her stew outside for a few extra minutes. When I finally cracked the door open just enough to see them but left the chain in place, the look on her face was worth every bit of effort I'd put into this plan. She was bright red with fury, her hair falling out of its neat bun, and my father stood behind her looking completely helpless. I kept my voice calm as I asked if I could help them with something, as if they were total strangers who had wandered onto my property by mistake. Linda demanded to know what I'd done to the locks, insisting that their keys should work. I told her, still in that polite tone, that I'd had the locks changed because I didn't feel comfortable letting strangers have access to my home. The words hung in the air for a moment before they hit her, and when they did, she looked like she might explode. My father tried to reason with me, saying they'd driven all that way and had no money for a hotel, but I reminded him that it sounded like a problem they should have thought about before deciding to exclude me from my own vacation. Brian shouted from behind them that they'd taken time off work and spent a fortune on the trip, but I didn't flinch. I simply told them it wasn't my concern anymore. Linda accused me of being selfish, of ruining what was supposed to be a beautiful family memory, but I didn't let her guilt me this time. I told her she couldn't have it both ways. If I wasn't family enough to join them, then I certainly wasn't family enough to provide the house they needed for their perfect vacation. I closed the door on her mid-rant and stood there for a moment, listening to them shout and pound on the door for a few more minutes before they finally gave up and left. By the time Amanda and the rest of my friends arrived that evening, I felt lighter than I had in years. We spent the night grilling on the deck, telling stories, and laughing until our sides hurt. The house was filled with warmth and joy in a way I hadn't felt in so long. And for the first time, I realized that the people who truly cared about me had been right there all along. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds outside and the smell of coffee drifting through the house, and for the first time in years, I felt completely at ease. Amanda was already on the deck, watching the sun glint off the lake's surface, and when I joined her, we just sat there in silence, soaking it all in. My phone sat untouched on the table beside me because I knew exactly what would be waiting if I looked at it. But I wasn't ready to deal with my father or Linda yet, not when I was finally starting to breathe again. When I did finally glance at my phone later that afternoon, the notifications made me laugh out loud. There were several missed calls from my father, 2 voicemails that I didn't bother listening to, and a text from Linda that was so long it took up my whole screen. The message was exactly what I expected, full of accusations about how I'd ruined everything and how heartless I was for turning my back on my family. She ended it with some dramatic line about how she was deeply disappointed in me and that I should apologize if I wanted to be part of their lives again. I stared at the message for a while, then set my phone down without replying because I knew there was nothing I could say that would make a difference. That night, as my friends and I grilled dinner and watched the stars come out, I felt something shift inside me. I realized I didn't care anymore about earning their approval or trying to fit into the family they'd built without me. Over the next few days, my friends and I settled into the kind of rhythm that made the lake house feel like home again. We spent our mornings kayaking and swimming, our afternoons fishing or napping in hammocks, and our evenings cooking big meals and playing board games until we couldn't keep our eyes open. Every moment felt like a reminder of what real connection was supposed to look like, and I cherished every second of it. After my friends left at the end of the week, I decided to stay on a few extra days by myself. The house felt peaceful rather than empty, and I spent the quiet hours sitting on the dock with a book or just watching the water. I started to remember why I loved this place so much in the first place, and I promised myself I wouldn't let anyone take that away from me again. When I finally returned to Cleveland, there was a letter waiting in my mailbox, addressed in Linda's careful handwriting. I rolled my eyes the second I saw it, but opened it anyway because I knew I needed to see it for myself. The letter was 3 pages of carefully chosen words, all designed to make me feel guilty and ashamed. She called me selfish, cruel, and ungrateful, said I'd shattered the family, and ended by declaring that until I apologized, they wanted nothing to do with me. I read the letter twice, then sat down at my computer and typed out a reply that was only 2 sentences long. I told her I wasn't sorry for a single thing I'd done and that I didn't want to speak to any of them ever again. I hit send, blocked all their numbers, and felt a weight lift off my chest that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. Over the next few weeks, they tried every way they could think of to reach me. My father called from different numbers, hoping I wouldn't recognize them. Linda had friends and even distant relatives call, pretending to check in on me before bringing up the situation at the cottage. I hung up every time, refusing to let them pull me back into the mess they'd created. About a month later, I was leaving work one evening when I saw my father waiting near my car, looking smaller and older than I remembered. For a second, I thought about walking right past him, but something in his expression made me stop. He asked if we could talk, his voice soft and tired, and I agreed, mostly because I wanted to hear what he had to say for himself. We sat at a small coffee shop across from my office, and I watched him fidget with his cup without drinking a drop. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked as he told me he was sorry, that he'd been weak, that he'd let Linda push me out and would regret it for the rest of his life. I asked him why now, what had changed, and he admitted that the vacation had been a disaster. Apparently, Linda and her son spent the whole trip complaining about me, about how I'd ruined everything, and the tension had been unbearable. My father said he realized then just how wrong they'd been to treat me the way they had. He swore Linda didn't know he was there talking to me, that she was still furious, but that he couldn't take it anymore. I sat there for a long time, thinking about everything he'd said, and I told him the truth. I told him I wasn't ready to forgive him, that what he'd done had hurt me too deeply for that. But I agreed to meet him for coffee again, just him and me, no one else. It felt like a start, even if I wasn't sure where it would lead. That night, I called my friend Carmen, who worked in real estate, and told her I was finally ready to start looking for a place of my own. I also asked her what it would take to rent out the lake house as a vacation property, and she said it would be easy, that demand was high, and I could make enough to cover a mortgage in the city. For the first time in a long time, I felt excited about the future, about building something that was mine alone, without anyone else's interference. The weeks that followed felt like breathing clean air after years of suffocating under expectations that never fit me. Every morning, I woke up feeling stronger, more certain that I'd made the right decisions, and more determined not to let my so-called family drag me back into their games. I met my father for coffee twice, always at a little cafe near my office where Linda wouldn't dare show up. And although it was awkward at first, something in him seemed different. He didn't make excuses or try to defend what happened, which was probably the only reason I agreed to keep meeting him. While we slowly tried to patch something together, I kept my focus on what came next. Carmen helped me tour condos and small houses in the city, and I started to picture what it would feel like to have a place that was truly mine. At the same time, I listed the lake house as a vacation rental, and within days, we had families lined up to book it for the entire summer. The money I stood to make would cover more than my mortgage on a city place, and the idea of turning that house into something that worked for me, rather than against me, filled me with satisfaction I hadn't felt in years. For a while, it seemed like maybe the drama was over, that Linda and her sons had given up trying to reach me, and I could finally move on with my life. But of course, the peace couldn't last forever, not with people like them. About 2 months after I blocked them all, I came home from work to find a thick envelope shoved through my mail slot. There was no return address, but the handwriting on the front made my stomach clench because I recognized it immediately. It was Brian's. Inside was a letter that managed to be both laughable and chilling. He accused me of tearing apart the family, of being selfish, of turning my father against them, and of robbing them of what should have been theirs. The part that really made my heart race, though, was at the end. He wrote that they had spoken to a lawyer and planned to contest my great-uncle's will, claiming that the house rightfully belonged to the family and that I had manipulated an old man into leaving it to me. For a few seconds, I just stood there staring at the paper, feeling my pulse pounding in my ears, but then I laughed. I had expected something like this eventually, which was exactly why I had taken Carmen's advice and transferred the deed into a trust the month before. The house wasn't in my name anymore, not directly, and any legal threats they threw at me wouldn't touch it. I almost felt sorry for them, wasting their time chasing something they couldn't reach. I didn't bother replying to Brian's letter because there was nothing to say that would change anything. Instead, I poured myself a glass of wine, sat on my tiny balcony, and watched the city lights come on as the sun dipped below the horizon. My phone buzzed with a message from Amanda, asking when we could plan another trip to the lake. I smiled, feeling the familiar warmth of knowing I had people in my life who truly cared about me, and I told her whenever she wanted. The part that still amazes me when I look back on all of this is how much happier I became once I stopped trying to please people who didn't actually want me around. I focused on my friends, my work, and my plans for my new place. And every day felt a little lighter. My father kept meeting me for coffee every few weeks, and while I didn't trust him the way I once had, I started to believe that maybe we could build something different. I thought that would be the end of the drama, but of course, there was still one last twist. About 4 months after the Lake House showdown, my father showed up at one of our coffee meetings looking nervous. He hesitated before speaking, like he wasn't sure how to say what he needed to say, and finally admitted that Brian had been pressuring him to get involved in their ridiculous legal battle. My father swore he hadn't agreed to anything and that he wanted no part of it, but I could see the stress eating at him. I told him the truth, that they didn't have a leg to stand on, and that if they tried, they'd only embarrass themselves. A few weeks later, I got an official letter from a lawyer representing Brian and Kyle, threatening legal action over the house. I handed it straight to the attorney who managed my trust, and within days, their lawyer sent a sheepish note backing off completely. That was the final straw for me, the moment I knew I never had to look over my shoulder again when it came to them. As summer came to an end, I signed the papers on a beautiful little condo downtown, with big windows and just enough space for me and the life I was building. The lake house stayed booked solid through the season, and Carmen was already lining up renters for next year. One evening, as I unpacked the last of my boxes and hung the final picture on the wall, I stood in my new living room and felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace. Then, out of the blue, I got a message that made me shake my head in disbelief. It was from Brian again, this time through some random email account I didn't recognize. He claimed he wanted to make amends, and that they were willing to let the past go if I would reconsider letting them use the house for a weekend. I deleted it without even reading to the end because I was done giving them space in my head. A week later, Amanda texted asking if I wanted to head to the lake house for a fall getaway. I told her yes without hesitation, packed a bag, and hit the road with her and Chris. The air was crisp, the trees were blazing with color, and as we pulled up to the cottage, I felt that familiar sense of belonging that no one could ever take from me again. We spent the weekend hiking, cooking, and sitting by the fire, and as I watched my friends laugh and share stories, I realized that I had built something better than the family I thought I'd lost. I had found my people, created my own peace, and taken back what was mine. And when I checked my phone one last time before bed, I saw a message from my father, just 4 words that said more than any letter ever could. He wrote, "I'm proud of you." I smiled, put the phone down, and listened to the quiet night, knowing that for the first time in a long time, I was exactly where I was supposed to be.